headphones and close your eyes. It's midnight, and you're listening to the Ghost Story Guys. Welcome to the Ghost Story Guys. I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestel.
And this is a show where we talk about spooks, specters, and all the other things watching us from the shadows beyond the campfire. Some conversations only make sense after the sun has set, and this is most definitely one. Thanks for tuning in. This is episode number 111, and we're coming to you from that tiny mountain cabin you dream about, but can never quite reach. How are you, Paul?
I'm very well, sir. Newly settled, new pad, no ghosts so far, but a spooky neighbour. So yes, we're all good.
I was going to say, it's not a Paul Bestel living situation unless there's something creepy involved.
It is a very odd house, and it's one of those where there's one light on at night, just one room illuminated, staring into the darkness.
So you've moved into that film The Burbs, is what's happened here.
Well, yes, rather that than some other horror films I could think of, definitely.
Yeah, give it time. Give it time. It is Sheffield, and the day is young.
Anything could happen.
Yeah, if I've learned anything from the stories you've told me about that place, that is true. I have nothing so interesting to report. I'm very much looking forward to getting to our stories today because we have another special guest on the show. We have the artist, Mr. Sam Shearon, with us here in the B segment, and we had a great time talking to Sam. Sam gave us so much time. I think we had him on the blower for almost 3 hours.
Mm.
And so I have no idea how long this show is going to be. It's sure as shit not going to be 3 hours, but...
You say that.
Yeah, oh God, I know. I shouldn't say things, Paul. I just shouldn't say things. But very, very quiet here. I don't know if I told you this, actually. I started, very briefly so far, working with a vocal coach.
Mm.
Yeah, so I ended up getting in touch with Nikki Griffin, and she is a vocal coach out of Ireland. And she's also one of the hosts of the Grim Reader podcast.
Ah.
If you like books, if you're at all into reading, fiction specifically, check out Grim Reader. They're three Irish gals. They read. They each bring a book to the recording. One of them has to guess based on the cover and the name of the book what the book is about, and they have to kind of like elevator pitch the story. And then the other person who has read the book then tells them, how close they are and explains the book and whether or not it's worth their time. And the show's a ton of fun. And at some point we're going to have them on our show. It's just going to be a matter of syncing up schedules. But when I reached out to them, Nikki mentioned that, hey, I'm a vocal coach, because I'd made some kind of joke about my voice. And so we connected, and she's been really great. We've only, again, just sort of had our initial consultation, but already I've learned from her, and I'm looking forward to actually kind of diving in properly, because I've never tried to maintain my voice. It's always just something I've done.
Mm.
But ever since last year when I got, and I'm pretty sure I had the big bad last year in early January.
Mm.
Ever since then, it's been harder for me to speak for long amounts of time. I've found that, yeah, it's ever since then, it's just my voice is different. It's a little different. It doesn't work quite as long and as well as it used to. So I've kind of sat on it for a long time because I'm a lazy bastard.
Yeah.
And then finally, I thought, no, I should do something. And so when Nikki kind of popped into, threw that out there, I thought, well, fuck, why not, right? It seems like it's meant to be.
Mm.
So yeah, so if you are looking for a vocal coach, she's a busy lady, but she knows her stuff. And again, you can find her via the Grim Reader podcast. And apart from that, I was kind of hesitant about talking about this on air, just because it's kind of personal, and no one wants a heart on the sleeve, Brent, all the time. But I had this really amazing Twitter DM, which is not something people often say, because usually when you get a DM on Twitter, you think, oh fuck,
I don't want to see that.
Yeah, exactly. Or will this racist tell me how bad I am at doing my show? I hope so.
Yeah.
But no, this was from a listener, and if you've been listening to the show for a long time, you will know this listener. You won't know the real name, of course, but they were the person who sent us the letter which formed the basis of the episode, The Other Side, When the Other Side is on Your Side. And again, I believe it was episode 22. And that episode, that email, and I won't get into it here. If you want to know the contents, I recommend listening to that show. It deserves to be heard in its entirety. But that email was really the one that kind of changed my perspective on the podcast. Because up until that point, it was just a thing we did in a room, you know? But getting that email from someone was like concrete proof that, no, there are people out there listening and this matters to them. That listener and I have kept, not quite in touch, but, the odd message here and there on Twitter. And then I want to say, I'm just going to check the date here. On May 3rd, she sent me a message. And I'm going to read it more or less in its entirety here. She says, "Hi, Brennan. I hope you're doing well. I haven't written in a very long time, but just had to reach out today. I'm hoping this is coming out lucid and not as chaotic and confused as I'm actually feeling. I just had surgery to remove my cancerous thyroid, and I'm on quite a buffet of painkillers at the moment. But that's not why I'm writing. A few hours after surgery, I had a very powerful dream that a short, round woman was at my bedside trying to comfort me. I looked past her and saw a disheveled, unshaven man in a plaid flannel sitting in a chair by the door. She saw me looking and said, 'Well, that's Brennan. He's having a run of bad luck and his thoughts are running through his mind like a freight train. I need to let him know that this too shall pass and that many better times are coming. The wounds eventually smooth over and there will be new stories to tell and healing will be present. Maybe you can let him know. I have no idea if any of this is going to be relevant or make an ounce of sense, but if it doesn't, can we just blame the morphine?' And she, says a few more words after that we don't need to share here, but it was really kind of a surprise. But a very lovely message. And the way she described the person telling this to her kind of rung a bell in my head. So I got in touch, and we have, basically she identified that person as my maternal grandmother, who passed on about 14 years ago. And so it was really a hell of a thing. And of course, like my maternal grandmother, she's nowhere on the internet. This is not, I've never have, as anyone in my family, to the best of my knowledge, put up a picture of her anywhere. So this is not like someone could pluck this from, the internet and do their research. Not that I think this person would ever do that, but, I know there's going to be skeptics out there who suggest that. But, yeah. And so certainly, obviously it has been a challenging year. I mean, Christ, for everyone, it's been a challenging year. But there have been other things as well that have sort of made this year more challenging than others. And that was just really nice. Yeah. But at the same time, it's kind of funny, because you and I talk about this stuff all the time. But to actually have it kind of reach out like that is hard to get your head around.
I suppose it is, because often when you get messages from the other side, it's not about us.
Yeah.
And for someone to be used as a conduit to pass something on, I find intriguing as well as deeply interesting, because it's not the way it normally happens.
Yeah. And the fact that, it seemed like the role of this person in this particular dream was more of a caregiver than as, like, it seemed like she was there to take care of her first, as opposed to like give this message first. And this, when my maternal grandmother passed, I only ever dreamed of her twice after she passed, I believe. The first time was when she would, because she went home on a Thursday. She took care of us when my mom was at work. She went home on a Thursday. It was her bowling night, and that was the last I saw her. She had a heart attack at bowling and passed the next morning. And for probably weeks, if not months after her death, I would have a dream where I'd be down in the basement of my house, and I would hear her voice upstairs in the kitchen. So I'd run upstairs to see her, but of course, every time I did, she was gone. And then finally, I ran up in the dream, and she was there. And I got to say goodbye and give her a hug. And for years after that, I never dreamed of her. And then, like I said, she popped up once, maybe twice, but again, only ever in the distance. She's someone I see and she waves. But we don't talk, it's not even very close. And, we've talked before on the show, you and I, about this notion that maybe there are different responsibilities in the life after this one.
Yeah.
And I wonder if maybe that's, she's kind of moved on and she has a purpose, and she's taking care of people on some level or another, and that's where her focus is. Yeah.
And maybe just thought that she needed to come back at that particular time just to give you some reassurance and support.
Yeah, so there's someone who tangentially, who knows me, who also needs care, and so there was, this opportunity for crossover.
Yeah. Well, while I'm here, can you just do this for me?
Yeah. Although Rachel made a great point, and she said she loves that I was profiled as a Canadian because I was wearing a flannel.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not up to date with Canadian fashion, so I'm not sure how realistic that is.
We're well into like everything denim now. You know, we moved on from flannel. Come on.
Oh, excellent.
2021. This jean tuxedo is not going to wear itself. All right. So as we said on this episode, Mr. Sam Shearon is here to tell stories with us. Sam's an incredible artist, great dude, very knowledgeable on the subject of the paranormal. And he has his own podcast that is not quite ready yet, but as he says in the interview, it's looking maybe at an August release. And of course, we'll keep you guys updated on that, because I think it's going to be, when it finally drops, I think it's going to be pretty great, because Sam does not do things halfway. We also have a musical guest on this show. We have a friend of the show, Michael LaBella. Michael's music has been on the show once before. This time around, we're going to be sharing a track from his latest album, Appalachia. The song is Black Mountain/Tracks. You can find more of Michael's stuff on iTunes and everywhere you stream your music. Again, the album I think is $9. If you like the music, pick it up. It's a nice gesture to let the artist know you care. But again, the artist is Michael LaBella. The song is Black Mountain/Tracks. And you'll be hearing that in the bumpers between segments on this show. And just before the break, we'd like to thank our patrons.
This one's for the patrons.
Patrons, we couldn't do what we do without you. You pay for the show, pay my salary, you make it all possible. And if you want to find out how to become a patron and take advantage of all the cool extra shit we offer, listen to the end of the show. We'll tell you all about it there. But for now, we'd just like to thank our latest patrons, and they are Logan Fong,
Ian Higgs,
Marion Cowley,
Whitney Bussey,
Cheryl Lyon,
Lizzie Hope,
Peace Cat,
Kathleen Keller,
Emma Fielding,
Gina and Victoria,
and James K. McGuire. Thank you all so much. Again, I do not have words to properly express how much your support of the show is appreciated, but it is a whole bunch, and again, you guys are the goddamn best. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Mr. Sam Shearon and stories of haunted bridges. Welcome back. As I said before the break, on this episode we have a very special guest, and he needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyways. Mr. Sam Shearon is a British artist based out of Los Angeles, specializing in horror and science fiction. His fascination with the supernatural, the paranormal, cryptozoology, and the unexplained has played a huge part in his work since his own childhood experiences growing up on the edge of a forest in England. Sam's created artwork for album covers, merchandise, comic book covers for Rob Zombie, Slayer, Ministry, Rammstein, Iron Maiden, Clive Barker. The list just goes on and on and on. He's created cover art for books, films, and podcasts by David Weatherly, Joshua Cutchin, the Small Town Monsters crew, of course our friend Shannon LeGros, among many, many others. His own podcast launches this year, with the first season covering ghosts, hauntings, and things that go bump in the night. Mr. Sam Shearon, welcome to the Ghost Story Guys.
Well, thank you. Hello, Brennan, and hello, Paul.
Welcome. Nice to speak to you, Sam.
This is the very first time I have ever spoken to you. I was a little nervous because previously it's only ever been via text. So far so good. Although, you know, we were talking about earlier off air about how this may yet end in an arm wrestling match challenge at some point. But we will see.
It could do. And I hope, when we finally meet in person that actually happens, because that's always fun.
I remember years ago I was passing through this street festival and there was literally a table with two beefy guys at it, and they had a sign saying "Arm Wrestling Club, come challenge us." And I thought, how fucking dumb do you have to be to see these two guys who look like they have watermelons for forearms, whose sole hobby is taking other guys' arms and pushing it over on his side, to think, no, I can beat them.
Well, arm wrestling always takes me back to my time as a child being convinced to go to the cinema to watch the Stallone arm wrestling movie Over the Top.
Oh, no.
Which is also one of the highlights of a brilliant documentary about Canon Films, which is just, 2 hours of batshit crazy films being spoken about.
That is a fantastic, fantastic documentary.
The best arm wrestling scene I think I can think of from any film would be from The Fly, where he snaps his arm.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Brilliant.
Usually when you have an arm wrestle and, you feel your arm kind of twinging and maybe that person's, going to win, you always have that little scene in the film replaying and you think, I should probably just quit now just in case it's not now.
Just in case. Well, it's the time you don't think it's going to happen. Honestly, I think if I'd gone up to that arm wrestling table, that probably would have been the end result. Just a compound fracture and a lot of tears. So, Sam, as I said, everyone, I think, is familiar with your stuff. I assume everyone listening. I think you're our first guest to have a Wikipedia page. But in regard to the upcoming podcast, to some degree, that's based in personal experience, yes?
Very much so, in the sense of, I guess my general interests, as with anyone else who would be listening to podcasts like yourself or, the Micah Hanks program or Expanded Perspectives, any of these Into the Fray podcast vibes of the unexplained is really where I'm going to be taking it. And it does come from a personal experience, an interest in all manner of unexplained, supernatural, paranormal events, stemming from childhood, really. No one really thinks that even when they're at school, you have all these dreams and aspirations about what you want to become. And in this field of the unexplained, it's never really had a clear path as a career until we have these now, situations where we can do podcasts and things like that. And some people go on, like Jim Harold, to have incredible careers doing their podcasts, and Mike Hanks too, of course. But with me, it's something that I've really wanted to tackle for a while. Because I have so many, I'm always, as you can tell, thinking in 5 different directions at once. And, I do that with my artwork. I do that with my editing for other people's sort of, website things, and just it's everywhere in my head. And there's kind of a running theme throughout everything, which has been this interest in the darker, supernatural, both fact and fiction. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to put it in all one big box and put it into a podcast with my artwork and music from friends, and really package it as something that I've wanted to do for years, but we've never really had a platform to do it until now, I suppose.
And do you have a general sense of when the show is going to launch?
Well, that's the funny thing, is I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and people say, oh, just get it out and get it done. And of course, yeah, I would, but I am actually waiting on certain things, music and, artwork needs to be finished, this, that, and the other. But as far as scripts and the topics and everything, it's all ready to go. So it's pretty exciting. I was aiming to launch around April, May, but then I noticed that August has a Friday the 13th in it, so I might wait until then.
So if I can ask, the show that you're planning, is it purely audio, or you mentioned artwork? So are you thinking sort of a hybrid of animation and audio, or something else entirely?
Well, it's good you asked that, actually. We have our podcasts across all the different platforms that, Spotify, iTunes, all the podcatchers, as they say. But then there's always YouTube as well. And I thought, what a great place to sort of host the artwork that I do, and have, little transitions, little sweeping animations, sort of, not full on, animated movies, but background imagery that can sort of pass through as people are listening to the audio. People may watch it. People, are generally just going to be listening to it in the car probably, or at the gym or whatever, I hope. But I think to have the visual aspect added to it on YouTube can also, feed into everything else that I do.
Obviously, you're going to be talking about the paranormal. But are we talking a storytelling approach? Are we talking an exploratory approach, or a combination of these things?
Well, my main hope for this is, in a sense, I'd like it to be considered as a sort of a resource area, very much cataloging and collecting in a journey, everything that I could possibly find on one subject, to sort of put it to bed in a sense. Not that I'm going to find any answers to the meanings of life or anything like that.
Right.
If anything, I'll probably find more questions. But this is definitely more of a documentary style rather than a conversational guest sort of platform. This will be me retelling stories, albeit true ones. There'll be no fiction there. This will be purely about trying to find out what's going on in regards to the supernatural, paranormal, things that we just simply cannot explain. Because I have so many, as we all do, interests in so many irons and different fires, to sort of pinpoint and lock it down as to one thing as well has been a bit of a sort of a challenge.
I suppose the biggest difficulty, Sam, is to keep a bottle top on it and focus yourself on, as you approach it there, what your main focus is going to be, and try and stay within those parameters, because as you refer to there, we've all got such varied interests and loves, especially when it comes to the world of the weird, that it's difficult sometimes to try and just focus on one particular topic or one particular style of investigation or in-depth sort of documentary style approach to it, because often these things have so many tangents and tentacles that you can end up going down rabbit holes without even trying.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I mean, I'm sure you'll all agree, it is all interwoven. Everything is sort of related to each other as well. So as much as it would be starting with ghosts and hauntings and everything that goes bump in the night, that is related to the UFO phenomenon. It is related to cryptozoology, because everything does seem to bleed into each other. So I think what will be nice is to have these parallels of these different podcast seasons that will intersect in a sense, so that hopefully people can go back and look at it as a resource and say, this episode connects to this one because of that aspect. And it'd be nice to sort of create some form of an online blueprint of a map to show a bigger picture of all of this phenomenon being related to each other. You've all heard the stories of Bigfoot stepping out of a UFO and is Bigfoot the ghost of a Neanderthal and things like that.
Going back to guys like John Keel, he was very much a believer in the ultra-terrestrial idea. The idea that there are intelligences beyond ours which kind of exist parallel to ours. And so that some of the things we're seeing in these cases, things like UFOs and some of these cryptids, are in fact temporary intrusions into our space by these creatures. And I'm kind of curious to know where you, after your research and of course a lifetime of interest in the subject, where you stand on things like that.
I think, that's a great question. And that's very much where I think I would not only just agree with it, I think everybody at this point in human history has to really start to accept. And this word theory gets thrown quite a lot all over the place. But, the multi-dimensional universe seems to be a fact. Talk about rabbit holes, Paul. You can go in any octopus direction and get completely just confuzzled until your head pops about science in general. And that's what we do know. Everything else that goes with it in terms of dimensions, you have to think, well, is that a place, is in a physical realm in a sense, that is that where creatures exist, live and breathe, like in another room in a house? Is it as simple as that? Or is this a completely different type of physics that we just cannot comprehend because we've never really even touched upon it to experience it and record it as a real thing? What the hell's going on? We don't know. I think we will know at some point, and we're getting closer to it every day. We've just discovered that gravity waves are real, and that's just opened up a whole new floodgate of theories and proven and disproven this, that, and the other. So in terms of creatures and entities and intelligences coming from different dimensions, I absolutely accept that there's something going on, that the veil thins, and mythology and legend talk about this. in their observances, but they call it other things, and the curtain of night and the big black veil of death and all of that kind of thing. But they're talking about the same thing, seemingly, where you could at least address it as that and put it into that box. That something has been going on since we've been able to write stories about it that is clearly real in every culture. There is a veil, there is another side to everything. And if beyond death we transition into this realm or into a different one, who knows? But I absolutely accept that every now and then little doorways open. And I think that's what's happening in hotspots around the world. That's exactly where things are coming and going. And maybe some of them stick around and get lost and then they're stuck here. And who knows? I mean, we just have endless stories of, beings from other worlds and dimensions.
I've heard you tell a story from when you were growing up. And it was about seeing something in your room when family had come to visit. And I wonder if you would share that story with us before we get started on the main topic.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's one of those things that'll always stick with me, and I think because it's always a danger for me to dress it up. Being an artist, being a creative mind, people will think, oh well, he's just embellishing things. But I always sort of bite my lip and say, okay, just tell it how it was. Just right. Every time I recite it, I always say, okay, just remember it as you remember it, and never ever add anything to it. And we go through our lives and they say that memory is fallible and all of that kind of thing. But I think if you tell the same thing enough times, it should stay there as long as you don't change anything. But yeah, the story, where do I begin? Well, I was 7 years old, grown up, born and raised in England. I was born in Liverpool, Everton, but I grew up on the edge of a forest in Runcorn, Cheshire, which is just a little outside Liverpool. And the woods was called Murdershaw Woods. And the name sounds ominous, Murdershaw, but it was actually spelled differently. It was Murdishaw, Murdishaw. But the story was that people were hung from these trees many hundreds of years ago, and that's how it got this sort of name, this town that I grew up in. So I'm 7 years old, and it was just me and my mum in this little house on the edge of a forest. And my aunt and uncle had come to visit. And I hadn't seen them in a while, so I was really happy. I was really excited to see him. And he'd brought me a dinosaur book, and I was all sort of, typical 7-year-old boy, thrilled, and my head was just buried in this book, and that was it. So it came to 10 o'clock at night, which was pretty late for a 7-year-old, for me anyway. It was bedtime. And my mum said, come on, that's it, bedtime. I wasn't going to see my aunt and uncle the next day. They were leaving early, I believe. And so I didn't want to go to bed. But that's the way it was. I was a good kid, so I went to bed. And I'm lying there in bed, and it wasn't a very big house. And I could hear the television and clinking of glasses and laughter from downstairs. And I always had the hall light on, never had complete darkness. And I always had my bedroom door open, not a crack, wide open, with the hall light on. So I was pretty much awake. There wasn't much that was going to be sending me to sleep. And I turned to face the wall to sort of try and go to sleep. And I couldn't get comfortable, so I turned back around again and faced the doorway. And there's my aunt and uncle stood in the doorway, and they'd come to say goodnight, and I was like, oh, great, I get to sort of say hi again. I didn't think I was going to see them again. So I sat up and I was like, oh, thanks for the dinosaur book, good night, have a safe journey home. And they just stood there. And they didn't say anything. And I was trying to make them out because they're silhouetted in a sense, if you imagine, the light from the hallways behind them shining into the bedroom. And they're silhouetted. So I look and I'm like, good night. And they didn't answer, and they just stood there. And that's when they started to take a walk into the room, and I realized that they were a lot shorter than they should have been. And it was a boy and a girl. And they had what I call Victorian clothes. They had what at the time I described frilly sort of knickerbocker outfits on. And, you can only imagine that's period costume. Your mind just goes there. Today, I think back to that. That's all I can remember it looking like. And so they're walking across into the room, and I'm just shouting, Mom, Mom. And she comes running upstairs. But as I'm, before this, I throw a pillow at them. And I look away because I just can't believe it's happening. I don't know who they are. What are they doing in my room? They're not saying anything. They're not running at me. They're just slowly walking diagonally into the room towards my bed. And so I throw my pillow and I'm screaming to high heaven. And as I look away, I want to look everywhere but at them. So I look up at the ceiling. And in the ceiling, this is where it gets really weird if it's not weird already. There's a green fireball the size of a soccer ball or a football or a large cabbage. And this green fireball is traveling around the ceiling in a circular motion, all around the corners, just making a little swirling around the top. And every time I look at this thing, this green fireball sweeps down towards me. So I shield my face, but it's making me look at them. It's almost forcing me to look away from it at them. And then I think, oh God, and I look back up again. And it's swirling around and it sweeps down almost to say, no, look at them. And, this is happening within seconds. This is like between seconds fast. All of this is going on. My mom comes into the room. As I say, she'd run upstairs. She looks around the room, grabs me by the arm. We leave. We sleep downstairs. And shortly after that, oh, it was a bad dream. This, that, and the other, just forget it. And I said, it wasn't a dream, Mum, what was going on? And she said, look, I'm just not going to talk about it, okay? We're done. Just, I don't want to hear about it anymore, kind of thing.
Oh, wow.
No, not in a horrible way. She just didn't want to talk about it. And years went by. I think it was maybe even just 9 or 10. And I said to my mum, what? Do you remember that night? It had come up in a family conversation somewhere about ghosts or something else. And I said, oh, Mum, do you remember that night? And she sort of gives me this look of, I'm not talking about it kind of thing, just this glare. and I said, what was going on? And she said, okay, look, listen, all I know is that there was something going on in your room that I didn't understand. And I just had to get you out of there. And don't ask me again because I don't like this stuff and I'm not talking about it.
Wow.
And to this day, she won't talk about it, but she says, yeah, it happened.
The presence of the color green is particularly interesting because we've had so many stories on the show where that has been a factor. I'd be curious to know, and again, I don't know much about the science of these things, but I'd be curious to know about where green sits on the spectrum of visible light, if that's a thing.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know where
that's
that
interesting.
Kind of fits in, because oftentimes I suspect with these things, and obviously we've got a whole lineup of stories coming, but I think we're not necessarily seeing the thing we think we're seeing. I think we're seeing the closest version of that our biology can allow us to comprehend.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think a lot of people, we don't realize that we have a very limited spectrum of vision. Mm-hmm. Whereas other animals, they see things in different ways. I believe deer can't see orange, which is why hunters wear bright orange.
Oh,
I had no idea.
Yeah. Which explains why when you have these hunters going into the forest and they say, well, I've been out here for years and I've never seen a Sasquatch. Well, it's obvious you haven't seen a bloody Sasquatch because you're wearing bright orange and we can see orange. And if they're anything like us, then they've seen you a mile away.
This is why I love this topic. There's no end to it. But on that subject, we have stories of strange things happening in and around bridges. I was really looking forward to this one. And Paul, before we get going, you had a particular haunted bridge you are familiar with.
Yes, one of my very favourite ghost stories is from Australia and is known throughout the country as the legend of Fred Fisher's ghost. And it takes us back to kind of the beginnings of Australia as a colonised country, sort of the beginning of the 19th century. And there was a gentleman called Fred Fisher who had a farm. And one day in 1826, Fred vanished, disappeared. Nobody knew where he'd gone, apart from his next door neighbour who owned the farmstead that adjoined Fred's. And this gentleman was called George Worrell, I think. And Worrell claimed that Fred had told him that he was returning to England, and a couple of months later that Fred had bequeathed George all this beautiful land that Fred used to own, which was ironically next to him. And a few people raised eyebrows, but it was, a rough and tough time in those early days of Australia, because obviously a lot of those people had been dropped there by the English to get them out of the way. So there were some interesting characters, to say the least, that were about the continent. However, about 4 months after Fred had vanished and Worrell had taken over all his land and his property, a gentleman called John Farley ran into a local hotel at his wit's end, terrified. And Farley claimed that as he was walking, he came across the ghost of Fred Fisher, sat on a bridge, pointing downwards into the water. People already were suspicious of Worrell's version of events, to say the least.
Yeah, no kidding.
And yeah, absolutely. It's very convenient how Fred upped and left and kind of gave him everything he owned. And so the police, apparently based on this suspicion of this sighting of Fisher's ghost pointing, decided to investigate the area and found the murdered body of Fred Fisher by the side of this creek. Worrell was arrested, eventually confessed, and was executed by hanging for the murder of Fred Fisher. And to this day, the town has embraced the legend of Fred and his vengeful ghost, and to this day now holds an annual Fred Fisher Ghost celebration, which brings people from far and wide to join in the celebration of a ghost that gained justice from beyond the grave.
And now, on with the stories.
My one and only. My favorite movie of all time is The Bridges of Madison County, and for years I'd intended to visit the two major locations from the film, Francesca's house and the Roseman-covered bridge in Winterset, Iowa. Finally, in 2016, after a long vacation in a neighboring state, I decided to detour through Iowa on my way home so I could finally check out those places. My first stop in Madison County was the house which in the film had belonged to Francesca, but it was gated off, and so I could only take pictures from a distance. I took what shots I could and got back in my car and set my GPS for Middle River and the Roseman Bridge, some 30 minutes away. By this point, it was evening, and rural Iowa was quiet and soft in the sunset. Arriving at Roseman Bridge, I was so happy that not only was it everything I would hope for, but no one else was around. So I was going to be able to take photos of it and actually walk across it. It was such a lovely evening, 70 degrees, no wind, and the birds were singing and the sun finished dipping below the horizon. I parked the car in the gravel directly before the bridge, and after getting out, spent some time reading the historical signs as insects buzzed somewhere along the riverbanks. Finally, I was ready to start taking photographs, and I couldn't wait. After taking several shots from the outside of the bridge, I was excited to actually get inside and cross over. And as I approached, I couldn't help but notice all the graffiti left by those who'd come before me. I read several of the names, dates, and inscriptions, and then began to cross the bridge. And the moment I was fully inside, a sense of uneasiness came upon me. In my enthusiasm, I dismissed the feeling as the result of being alone in a rural setting and about to enter an enclosed space that was beginning to get dark. But the further I went into the bridge, however, the more a sense of unease consumed me. About a quarter of the way in, it began to sound like the wind was blowing hard outside and the bridge began to creak a lot. Rationally, I told myself it was a wooden bridge and wood creaks, but it stuck with me that there had been no wind outside whatsoever just a moment before. Briefly, I considered turning back, but coming the distance I had, only to turn back because of some inclement weather seemed ludicrous, and so I pressed on. As I got to the center of the bridge, it began to tremble, and I mean full-on shake. It wasn't just my perception either. Small pebbles and dirt and what I think was dried bat guano was bouncing up and down on the wood floor in front of me. Still, I was trying to be rational and found myself wondering if perhaps the bridge was unsafe and they'd forgotten to signpost it. Didn't make any sense, of course. They would have closed it off, at least put a sign up. I literally thought the bridge was going to collapse into the middle of the river and me along with it, so I walked faster. The wind had apparently died down by the time I reached the other side of the bridge, as the night was as silent as it had been on the other end. The uneasiness was gone, but my heart was racing, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. Deep inside, I knew damn well there'd been no wind, but my car was on the other side, and there was only one way to get there. My fear was such that I spent some time standing in the tall grass at the river's edge, considering whether I could ford the water. But I wasn't keen on ending my vacation with a guest spot of drowning victim on the local news. Deciding that I didn't really have any other choice, I made my way to the entrance and looked around. Everything was as it should be. The sun had fully set, the darkness was gathering, and as I started to enter the bridge again, that feeling of uneasiness, almost full-on doom, returned, and I stepped back out. The feeling left me. What was going on? By this point, I was desperate to get back to my car, and I had no choice but to enter the bridge again. And the uneasiness came right back. Walking as fast as I could, head down and arms swinging, I kept internally pleading for there to be no shaking this time. As I reached the center of the bridge, that sense of doom became stronger and stronger. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and it felt as though someone else was there with me. But there was no way I was going to look around and find out. As I passed the midway point of the bridge, I actually heard and felt something fly over the top of my head and touch my hair. At the same time, a blast of cold air hit my entire body. It was like walking past an air conditioner. Was it a bird? A bat? Who cares? I took off running. The moment I was safely on the other side of the bridge, that uneasiness faded and I ran to my car. I don't have a reasonable explanation for any of it, but I do know that will be my one and only trip to Roseland Bridge.
And that's why you should never go to Iowa. My apologies to Slipknot, but nope. There's a particular quality to bridges. And I don't know if it's that metaphorical sense of crossing from one place to another, or if it's the fact that you are, on a span of things, over top of a drop that could very well kill you or just, straight up drown you. But there is always that sort of sense of a little bit of vulnerability when I'm on a bridge. And I've never been I don't think I've been on a covered bridge, but I feel like that would make it worse somehow.
Yeah, you feel trapped, don't you?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like the way the bridge was shaking, I think I would have just very, very quickly given up on my enthusiasm for the filmography of Clint Eastwood and just got back into my car and gone home.
Yeah. It has all of those troll under the bridge tropes and Mothman and everything.
And also the fact too, the sunset, sort of, there's always that particular time of day when things seem more possible. And I mean, obviously night, deep night has its own set of possibilities, but there is something about twilight, about sunset, that just seems, I don't know, there's a quality to it. And I know, Paul and we've talked about this before, but when I was a kid, I didn't like leaving my house in the winter between 4 and 6 p.m.
Interesting.
There was something about the light, and I don't know where this started or when, but there was something about the light that was kind of upsetting. And
Magic hour.
Maybe that's what it is, yeah.
Yeah, it's the between again, isn't it? Is it the actual doorway between worlds? It's the between night and day. It's that zone, the twilight zone.
Yeah. And I'm curious, in your work, your visual arts, you really do kind of explore middle places. Like your biomechanical work in particular, you sort of explore that meeting of flesh and steel. And I'm kind of curious as to where that interest comes from.
I think if anything, it's it's an interest in horror and horror films from an early age, and books, particularly Clive Barker and H.P. Lovecraft. Anything that shouldn't be, that's not your average, daily thing like a bowl of fruit, fascinates me. Like Frankenstein is, of course, the ultimate horror story in terms of science and what really is horrifically impossible. The way it was done and the emotions that are attached to that sort of thing, I find the most exciting part about combining machines with living flesh, and especially if it isn't quite working, almost in an underground, desperate way, even in a post-apocalyptic way where things are rotten and you're using sort of other things to make things continue living. I find fascinatingly horrific and aesthetically pleasing to look at.
Speaking of Clive Barker, I recently rewatched Lord of Illusions.
Ah, yes.
And man, that film has its flaws, but at the same time, there is some really chilling stuff in there. Every now and again, it's like when the dentist is kind of poking around in your mouth and he hits the nerve, and everything just blows up. There are some points in that movie that are very much like that. Just these incredibly gripping images that feel so. They're new. We haven't seen them before, but they seem very old.
Yeah, any translation of someone's writing, whether it be H.P. Lovecraft or Clive Barker, those on film are always never enough for me. There's a recent film with Nicolas Cage, The Color Out of Space. I don't know if you've seen that yet.
Oh, yeah. I actually have a copy on the shelf here.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Without ruining for the audience, there's flesh melding moments in there, which the transitions and the effects alone are just brilliant for this day and age. But the concept of it, the subject matter of things that, again, shouldn't be, is so appealing to me. It's the unknown. It's the adrenaline rush you get from fear. The greatest fear is the unknown, as Lovecraft said.
Have you seen the film Society?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
I have it on VHS.
Right.
Yeah.
Classic.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't know if Corruption of Flesh gets any better than Society. Yeah. That film sticks with you.
Yeah, that's a disturbing one. That needs to be remade, I think.
I don't know if they could. I mean, I guess there are some guys out there doing that kind of work, but I don't know. It's got such a dangerous feeling to it. I think if you were going to remake Society, though, there's one guy, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work, but there's one guy I think could pull it off, because I've seen I think everything he's done so far, and it really has that unsettling sort of bass note to whatever he does that kind of adds a note of unease, and that's Adam Egypt Mortimer.
Not familiar.
Okay, if you get a chance, check out Daniel Isn't Real or Arch Enemy. Those are the two. I think the two films I can think of off the top of my head. But Daniel Isn't Real stars Patrick Schwarzenegger and this other fellow whose name I forget. But he is a young man struggling with what he thinks might be mental illness, but he's not sure. And he has this alternate personality who is sort of returns after being with him in childhood and starts to mess with his perception of the world and the people in it. And it's got some really great body horror effects in it as well. So yeah, definitely check that out.
Ooh, yeah. And another Schwarzenegger, you said? Patrick Schwarzenegger?
Yeah, it's the big guy's son.
I thought there was only one, but yeah, okay, his son. Wow.
We've lived long enough now that we're seeing the next generation of these guys, Paul and Sam, and I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Yeah. I just turned 43 in March, just gone, and I'm loving it now. But when I turned 40, I really didn't like it. It was just oh no. I think I mentioned this on another podcast as well. Depressing. You want to hear something depressing? So I'm 43 now. If I'm one of the lucky ones that lives to around 80, and that's an if, then I've got about 2,000 weeks left.
Oh, I don't like that at all.
That's depressing, right?
Yes. How many summers do I have left? Ah, fuck. Okay.
Mongrel. I live in the rural town of Port Hedland, and 2 weeks ago, something happened while I was out on a walk. It was about 5:30 in the evening, and I was alone. Ordinarily, I walk with my dog Dennis, but he was unwell at the time and didn't feel like going any further out of the house than he had to. Port Hedland is a coastal town near the northern end of Australia and is prone to heavy rain from cyclones. The annual torrents require an extensive system of ditches running through the town to drain water off the roads. There also tends to be a lot of empty land between blocks of houses, massively overgrown with weeds that are only occasionally burned or trimmed away by the council. I was walking along a narrow concrete bridge when I heard heavy breathing from the ditch below me. At first I thought it was a drunk, but when I got far enough away to be able to see underneath that part of the span, there was no one around. More relaxed and curious now, I walked back onto the bridge to ponder the origin of the sound, which promptly resumed. This time, I boldly leaned over the railing and looked right under the bridge, seeing nothing more suspicious than empty beer cans, discoloured in the sun. I straightened up, and just then, stinking hot breath blew in my ear. I felt fear, pure, unadulterated fear. There was no obvious source to the smell, but it stayed with me, and the heavy panting continued. In an instant, I recognised the smell, the rotten flesh smell unique to the breath of a dog on a bloody diet. My mind went back to another walk, one Dennis had come on, when we'd come across the path of a huge feral mongrel that had bared more of its teeth the closer we got. Had it returned? Before I could think much more about it, there was a sudden invisible pressure on my chest. I expected paws, but didn't quite feel them. Even now I can't quite discern the shape of the force that held me, whether I was restrained by paws, claws, hands, or something flat. A vicious howling erupted in front of me. Thoughts of the dog filled my mind, until I couldn't even see where I really was. All I saw was that killer mongrel from my run with Dennis, peeking his nose out of the bush, coolly deciding how close he would allow me to come before he lunged. Unable to think straight, I imagined that this is what was supposed to have happened, that I had fluked my way out of some cosmic debt, and now the collector was knocking. Then it was gone. I didn't move for some time. There is a very interesting tradition. There are numerous stories about black shucks here in the UK, and barghasts and padfoots and whatever you want to call them, depending on which part of the UK you live, where bridges do come into play quite a lot.
Interesting.
Often people find a bridge as a sanctuary or as a barrier that the shuck can't cross.
I wonder if that's something to do with the running water.
Well, that is a tradition that they believe that the water holds them back, whatever they are, and going onto the bridge basically is a barrier to them even following them, and that's how they can sort of navigate themselves to safety. But it's
yeah. See, that's I'm glad you pointed that out. That's something I was going to mention earlier with the running water aspect. We have these even with Legends of Vampires. They don't have the ability to cross running water, and I wonder if that's why these things hang around bridges, is because that's the only place where they can.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
because
so
they're sort of bound.
There. Yeah. Well, bridges and water and creatures lurking them, as Sam mentioned earlier. Obviously, we've got Norwegian relatives in our family, and Norway has a great tradition in trolls. So they're a very interesting sort of section of folklore and myth in regards to their often associated with being under a bridge and challenging people from far and wide who dare to try and across their threshold, as it were.
Yeah, and mostly these days, though, trolls appear online.
Mind you, I was speaking to somebody who is of the opinion that the troll is actually the Scandinavian version of Bigfoot.
Yes, yeah, I've heard a few of those. There's quite a few. Even the Legends of Krampus can be sort of tied into Bigfoot at some point.
Now, I got to say, I like the idea of Bigfoot talking shit at me on the internet a lot more than I do some sweaty asshole in a basement.
Yeah. Well, we know he can use the phone, so why not?
That's right.
After what happened the other week.
Oh God. Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was awful.
Yeah, I wouldn't say educating Brennan about that, Sam. I was just basically just telling him about it. That was just.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
man.
I almost threw my phone across the room when I.
Yeah. No thanks, Bigfoot.
Done. Don't need to see that anymore.
Yeah, it's even worse when you see the footage that he's.
That's what I'm saying. It was so bad.
The phone call added to his friend in makeup that is allegedly Bigfoot as well in Russia. It's a terribly shit combination.
Yeah.
If you're new to the show, the fellows are talking about the Nebraska Bigfoot conference from a couple weeks back, where a researcher allegedly got Bigfoot well on the phone.
Yeah.
It was good old Igor Burtskov, wasn't it? Or someone?
Yeah. Burtsoff. Igor Burtsoff.
Burtsoff,
yeah.
there you go.
Yeah. With his straight, he's one of those as well that he's got footage of Bigfoot attacks, but things turn up after he's moved the camera away from something happening, and then he goes back and goes, "Oh look, there's a rock. There's a rock someone's thrown at us."
Oh no!
What luck?
Of course. Yeah, it's incredible. It's uncanny.
7 bridges. Years ago, when I was very young, a member of our family died and we had to travel by car to attend the funeral. We left our home in Manila the same evening we learned of the death. My father, mother, and I squeezed into the family car with as much luggage as could quickly be packed. At the time, I was only 5 or 6, so my memory is hazy, but I'll tell you the story, which is based not only on my memories, but my mother and father's, as best as possible. We were headed north that night, in the direction of Bayambang, along a 2-lane road that wound through a forest of balete trees. At some point, my mother thinks near Tarlac, we passed by a gas station, then 7 different bridges. My father hadn't made the trip in a long time, and didn't remember the way, so after taking the wrong turn several times and ending up back at the gas station, he decided to try the bridge. Partway across, he spied a boat full of people, with one of them holding a lamp. So he pulled over and got out of the car to call down and ask directions. As he did, the light vanished into thin air, and so did the boat. After this, the car refused to start. Mom decided we needed help and that we should try one of the country houses we'd seen along the way. Together, the 3 of us walked down the empty 2-lane road back in the direction we'd come from. The only sound apart from our footsteps was the croaking of frogs, hundreds of them from the sound of it. After a few minutes of walking, we were not alone anymore. A red Volkswagen full of men seemed to be creeping up alongside us. Stranger than that, though, the men were all dressed in gray suits and had no faces. Before we could panic about this, the car simply vanished, like it had never been there. Afterward, we walked faster, only to have yet another vehicle turn up behind us, driving slowly. This time it was a 10-wheeler truck, which you would not expect to see on such a narrow road, and again it was driven by men in gray suits. It too vanished after only a few seconds. Mom and Dad started to panic, though they tried not to let me see how unnerved they truly were. Just as things were reaching a boiling point, we came to one of the houses we had seen driving past. Dad knocked and explained our situation to the gatekeeper who answered the door. He asked if it would be possible for us to stay until morning, but was told no. According to the gatekeeper, the house was already full, and when Dad looked past him into the living room, he said that laying on the floor were more people like we'd seen in the cars. Gray suits and no faces at all. We hurried back to the car, intending to wait inside until morning, but on a whim, Dad tried the engine and it turned over on the first try. We decided to backtrack, but even though we were taking exactly the same path, nothing looked quite as it had, and we didn't pass any of the 7 bridges. Not only that, but at one point the road inclined enough we had a pretty good view of where we'd just been, and in the distance we could see only 2 bridges, not 7. Somehow we managed to find our way back to the gas station, which was a good thing as all the driving meant the car was running out of fuel. Weirdly, we couldn't see the bridge we had attempted to cross earlier, so my father asked the pump attendant what was going on. The man gave him a funny look, then said the bridge had been washed out for a while. He pointed to his sign across the road, which said the same thing, and we all wondered how we could have missed that earlier, or how it was possible we'd been on the bridge. Over the next several hours, no matter how far we tried to move away from the gas station, in spite of the lefts and rights we took, we always passed the same buildings and the same sign warning us of the washed-out bridge. This time we knew we were being played by Encanto, evil spirits or elementals, and we decided to take a rest in the house of one of my dad's old school friends who lived in the area. Thankfully, they remembered him, and we were able to pass the remainder of the night there safely. This next part is what I remember most. Around 3 a.m., we were awakened by a familiar sound. The ice cream bell. Though we didn't see the vendor, we were hearing the bell and vendor cart moving outside the house. It didn't make any logical sense. The next day, we continued on our way, passing the washed-out bridge one final time. What's interesting about this one is that in the comments on the post, the person telling the story said that one of the methods for getting your way out of this kind of enchantment is to turn your clothes inside out. You know, usually like wearing, and I recall Bob Vasquez, who's submitted a number of stories to us. He's mentioned this as well because he has a number of very, very frightening stories from the Philippines. But if you turn some of your clothes inside out, apparently that is kind of a way to break the enchantment. But this person had actually tried that. And so I'm kind of, and they suggested that maybe somehow this wasn't fooling them. And I kind of wonder if they just got lost. But, again, it's hard to say. What are your thoughts, Paul?
Well, that tradition also applies to the fairies.
Of course, yeah, I forgot about that.
That if you become enchanted or bedazzled by them, that to break free from the spell, you should turn your clothes inside out. Or if you're concerned that you may be at the whim of the fae, that you should wear your clothes inside out to confuse them.
Officer, the reason I took off my pants in this TGI Fridays. Yeah, we're not falling for that one again, Store.
So I think that's very interesting because the Spanish were the first Europeans to arrive in the Philippines. So they wouldn't really have brought that tradition with them. So I find that very interesting that you have that kind of cultural response to an enchantment from opposite sides of the world. I find that fascinating.
Those kind of threads, when you see these similarities pop up in cultures that are not connected, always really catches my eye. Like there's the presence in so many cultures of a multi-eyed creature, which seems to either be death or be part of the death process. And they all, as I recall from the reading, they all have very similar names. There's usually some variation of ZA. You know, we've talked a little bit on the show before about Za, this Tibetan legend of a multi-eyed serpent creature that guards the gulf between life and death. And of course, Azazel and Azrael, these like angels of death, are also very, very popular in culture. You see them pop up in many places.
Pazuzu,
yeah, there you go. There's even that, what is it? There's the Ouija board thing, which I tend not to put a lot of stock into, but it's similarly named.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah. Zozo, that's it, Zozo. I will say stuff like Zozo, I think, is one of those things that kind of makes us all look a little bad.
Yeah, it's fascinating when things get regurgitated. And, I was talking to someone the other day about how people will have a pop culture name, something like Zozo or something that is just catchy, that sticks and it's easy to remember. And so it becomes the name for other things. And that muddies the water on... I come from a place of skepticism in a sense that I absolutely acknowledge the existence of things we don't understand, but I love to see what they are in as much detail as possible, which is why when I illustrate things, I like to make them look as though it's from a natural history book. It has to look as though it could be real. And so when you have someone renaming something that's clearly fictitious, like Slender Man or the Rake, which are products of creepypasta, people then bestow these names onto things that they've seen and say, oh, I saw this, when it could quite easily have been something else. And then when you call it that, whatever it is, let's just say, you've seen the rake. People already have a catalog in their mind of what a rake looks like. And so they're seeing in their mind something that's completely different to what you saw. If you're with me, it's completely muddies the water, and it's really quite annoying.
Yeah, there's a book on Slender Man that had me wanting to just hurl it out the window for that reason.
All of them, yeah.
Well, the Chupacabra is a prime example of that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Puerto Rico, it's some kind of weird lizard alien hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
And then within 10 years, it's some kind of dog running about in Texas and Arizona and Mexico. And it's nothing, they're nothing like. And why? Because I remember seeing that footage of those police officers who see that long-snouted dog-like animal running down the road, and the woman goes, "Is that the Chupacabra?" And I'm thinking, where have you got that from?
Yeah. And, the same thing happens with the Thunderbird when you have pterosaurs and giant eagles and raptors and things. They're all under the category of the umbrella term Thunderbird, but they're all very different things. And that's fine, and I would even say that the Chupacabra as a broad spectrum, we have about 10 different descriptions of them, some looking more like grey type aliens, some with spines, some have bat-like wings, some are more vampire-like, like giant bats, but it looks like a giant bat crossed with a chimpanzee, And then, as you say, you have all these variations of blue dogs and hairless dogs with mange and crossbred coyotes with domestic dogs and mutants and all of that kind of thing. So when you have this umbrella term of Chupacabra just for everything, when the term, as we know, means goat sucker, it gets a little bit confusing and annoying.
I'm reminded of years ago, and Sam, I don't know if you've heard the story. I won't belabor it because it's quite lengthy, but when I had my shaman encounter back in 2013, he told me that his name was his spirit name was Thunderbird Heartstrong, and I remember he told me that Thunderbird comes to speak to him in the night, but he said Thunderbird he appears as a glowing man dressed very simply in a white t-shirt and blue jeans. But he said as I recall, he said his eyes were on. I think he said something about his eyes were on fire or something like that. But he said Thunderbird speaks to me, but this is how he appears.
That's terrifying. Blue jeans are awful. Night hunting. So this took place when I was probably about 17. At the time, I was out hanging with my then boyfriend and one of his friends. Now, one thing to put out here is that his friend was pretty outdoorsy kind of guy. He wasn't scared of much. He grew up hunting and was always out exploring the woods at all hours. Living in a small town with a lot of parks and surrounded by wooded areas, there wasn't a lot to do, so exploring the woods was a typical thing for really any of us to do. This particular night, his friend decided that he wanted to go spotlight hunting. Yes, illegal, but we were kids and I had no idea. So we drove out on a gravel road in my boyfriend's car. There used to be a bridge that went across the river, but it was burnt out and eventually torn down, so it was closed off, and the end of the gravel had become overgrown with brush. In the distance, you can see the new bridge, a tall structure the town is actually fairly well known for. We were miles away from town and from any houses. My boyfriend and his friend grabbed their flashlights and the rifle out of the trunk, but being an animal lover, I didn't really feel like taking part, so I chose to stay in the car. Before my boyfriend took off into the field, he told me to give them 15 minutes or so, and if they didn't come back, I could take his car and leave them. And with that, they disappeared into the dark. So there I was, sitting in his car. There was a metal railing in front of the car, which the guys had to climb over. On both sides of the car, there was tall grass, taller than the car. It was a bit spooky, but I turned the radio on to keep myself and my mind busy, and I waited. 15 minutes went by, and I hadn't heard any gunshots, so I figured they must be having rotten luck. Then I got a weird feeling, like I was being watched. It was strong enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to play it off as my nerves, but I look out the window to my right, and I could see the tall grass moving. I told myself it was the wind, But then I looked out the driver's side window to find the grass over there standing still. I'd seen enough horror movies to know that I didn't want to look out the right window again. Ignorance is bliss, right? So I looked down at my phone and did everything I could to not look up, scared I might see something that I didn't want to see. Then something hit the back of the car, hard. I looked back, but with the tint and the darkness, it was impossible to see anything. So I checked the locks to make sure I was safe and turned up the radio. The knocking on the trunk and back window continued on and off. At this point, it had been an hour since they had left, and I was hoping it was just them trying to play a joke on me. I knew I couldn't leave them out there, and there was no way I was getting out of this car. So there I sat, trying to ignore whatever was out there. The knocks soon turned to shaking the car. I shrank down into my seat, waiting for the guys to get back. After about 15 minutes, the banging stopped, and I was left in silence for about another 15 minutes. When I heard the guys yelling, I sat up and flipped on the headlights to see my boyfriend, who had never touched a gun in his life, running towards the car, cradling the rifle in his arms and vaulting over the metal railing. His friend came running soon after. I unlocked the doors. My boyfriend jumped in the driver's seat, throwing the gun in the back seat where his friend was scrambling to get in, yelling, "Go, go, go!" He quickly backed out, and off we sped down the gravel road. My boyfriend's face was contorted with terror, and he started yelling at his friend, "What the hell was that?" His friend was looking out at the back of the window, terrified, and shouted, "It's following us!" I was both scared and confused. I kept asking what they were talking about and what happened, but they were too busy trying to calm down. We sped out as fast as his car could go, back down towards town. Once it was clear we were safe, I asked again what happened, only to be told they didn't want to talk about it. Whatever it was, it had scared them more than I've ever seen someone scared before. I questioned my boyfriend for the next several days, but he always just got a weird look on his face and would shake his head, like he didn't believe it himself. It was about 9 years later before I got an answer. I'm actually married now, with 2 kids, and one on the way. Well, it just so happens that my husband had this guy starting at work with him on his job. It took a couple of weeks and on-the-job stories from my husband to realize that this guy was the friend of my boyfriend all those years ago. I decided to open up to my husband and tell him about this horrifying experience we all had back then, and I suggested he text the guy that he worked with, the friend of my ex, and ask him about that night. And the response was not what I was expecting. The guy replied, saying how that night haunts him. He told about how they were out in the field, not having much luck, when they heard a whole bunch of birds in the grass suddenly take flight, making them jump. They went over to where the birds had been, and it was there, in the flashlight's beam, that they saw him. The friend said he was unusually tall and lanky, as well as very pale. It was odd to see anyone out there at that time of night, let alone being out in a large field lined with forest. He just didn't belong. Then he went on to say that the weirdest thing about this guy was his voice. It was unexpectedly high-pitched, almost like a child. What did the guy say? Well, this is the part that sends shivers down my spine. Apparently, he said, "You might want to check on that girl you left back in the car." This friend described how they ran back through the field, across a ditch and back to the car. He said they were running as fast as they could, and this guy was running parallel to them, but through the wooded area, a much harder route, and yet he was keeping perfect pace with them. The trees and terrain didn't slow him down at all as they sprinted back to me in the car. That's when we had started speeding back home. He said that when he looked back, he saw the guy stepping over the metal barrier next to the road. They had to vault to climb over it, but this guy stepped over it like it was nothing. Although I've tried researching similar encounters, I can't find anything. The only thing I know for sure is whatever that was, it wasn't human.
There's so much there, but Sam, you said that you particularly liked this story. What about it jumped out at you?
For me, I'm always fascinated about stories of Bigfoot that don't fit your general furry ape scenario. I always love the Bigfoot stories where it's more human, and sometimes it resembles a Native American, or literally just a giant human that's wild, or a wild man. And so when you have these random stories of incredibly disturbing, oversized people out in the middle of nowhere that have strange, sinister voices or screechy voices, or it's almost like they're trying to emulate a voice, or they've heard similar words, and they've picked up maybe some English. Those kind of stories fascinate me. And this one, I have to question: was he wearing clothes? Was it a naked man out in the middle of nowhere, or was he wearing a suit? I want to know more. And so this kind of thing really grabs me because there's very little to it.
It's one of those stories that it's very unique, as the teller mentions, that they've not been able to find any kind of comparison, and it is peculiar because when you have an encounter that's as unsettling as this, even before it speaks, because I think there's something peculiar about the perception of voice, that I'm sure all of us have had a situation in our lives where we've seen someone and for some reason your mind has decided before you hear them talk what they will sound like. So when something vocalizes and it's not what you're expecting, that can often add another layer of fear to an already deeply unsettling encounter.
It's disturbing.
Maybe I'm predisposed to this because I have an interest in the subject, but this feels to me like an encounter with liminal space, like a kind of borderland. I think there are places in the woods and places in the world where the boundaries break down. The rules are different, and maybe not for everyone. There's one place in particular, and I can tell you about this off air, Sam, but there's one place in particular that I'm aware of, and I very much think this is one such place where to most people it's one thing, but to certain people who approach it at a certain, we'll say with certain mindsets or with certain baggage, I don't know what those variables are, but it's a very different and actually much more dangerous place. And
wow, yeah.
I think that in this case, that's what they've encountered. I think they are bumping up against another set of rules. For example, a more like earthly version of this is something we've talked about here before. The couple from, I want to say Virginia. They're actually mentioned in Missing 411, but it's a husband, wife, and I think their daughter. Maybe their kids, plural. But they had gone to scope out some property they were going to buy, and their truck was found. Their dog was in it. He'd almost starved because he'd been in there so long. But they were not found until much later, and they were found over the mountain together, dead. And the implication was that they had been killed, because apparently this area was known for things like meth labs and illegal grow ops and stuff like this.
Yeah.
The reason I mention it is because it's an example of when we run up against a place where we are now subject to different rules. And even though we do not understand what they are, we are still subject to them. Like when you're living in LA, no doubt you've bumped into people who are dangerous people.
Oh yeah.
And it's so easy to step a little bit too far.
Speaking of Los Angeles, I remember being at a chap's house with a number of friends after we'd been out drinking in various bars in LA, and I was sitting on this couch, and of course there's ashtrays everywhere, and glasses of after hours drinking inside this person's house, and I had knocked something on the table that had dropped onto the floor in front of me and rolled between my feet under the couch, and so I thought, oops, better grab that, and so I reach under the couch and I find a shotgun. And I think, oh, that's nice. I'll just leave that there. So, and then I kind of look up because my arm is still down there, reaching under the couch, and I look up to see if anyone has noticed. And the chap sat across the room, and he's just sort of smiling and nodding at me. And so I slowly move my hand back up again, and I sort of acknowledgingly nod back, and that was it. Nothing happened. But this chill factor of the underlying danger was there. You know, you have that sixth sense of what's going on here, you know?
Yeah. So this just jumps out at me as a possible example of people who were stepping into a situation they could not possibly comprehend. And they were just lucky that whoever's, I don't want to say territory, but whoever's world they bumped up against was kind enough to warn them. Because I think that's not always the case. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of, I have a huge interest in missing people. And I do think quite often, especially in some of these missing 411 cases, I think you are bumping up against something you don't understand. And I think these people are not prepared for it, either physically or psychologically. And I think the end result is that you are no longer here.
The Husky. This story takes place near my old house here in Springfield, Missouri, where I lived for 2 years. It was the spring of 2013, and I'd headed out to take the dogs for a walk. We were going towards the creek trail, about a block from my house, when this beautiful husky puppy ran up to us, seemingly out of nowhere. He was so friendly, and my dogs were excited about their new friend. He didn't have a collar, so I decided to take him back home after our walk and try and find his owner. Along the creek trail, there are a few bridges to walk under and open grassy space all around the trail, and of course, there is the creek. We passed under the first bridge, Pup still trotting along beside us. Then we neared the second bridge, which we had to walk up and over. I started walking up top, but the puppy decided to walk under instead, which is rocky but doable. My dogs and I waited on the other side to meet our friend, but he never showed up. The area was wide open, so if the other dog had run off in pretty much any direction, I'd have been able to see it. So for the next 10 minutes, I searched. I even climbed under the bridge and clambered over the rocks to see if maybe he'd somehow fallen down and gotten hurt. But there was only so many places to hide. He was just gone. But where did he go? Eventually, I continued on and never saw that beautiful puppy again.
So, Sam, before we move on to the next story, I really wanted to ask you, because we have a lot of artists, both accomplished and in sort of aspiring, who listen to the show. And I thought it would be really useful for them to hear from someone who has done the thing. Like, you're a professional artist. This is how you make your living. And I thought it would be really useful and inspiring for them to hear sort of how you got your start. And would you mind letting us in on some of that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I don't think there's any real correct way of doing anything in terms of getting somewhere professionally. And at the same time, I don't want to say that it just happens and it's luck. It does require work. As with everything that's, beneficial in your life, you've got to put the effort in. But I would say that, I went to school, art college, did university, got the degree and all the rest of it. And I'm not knocking further education, but without sounding pretentious, I didn't really get too much out of that. I already had my own sort of skills in a way that I'd developed from very early childhood. My mum said I've been drawing monsters since I could hold a pencil, so I was pretty adept at illustration to begin with. So when I did my university degree, it was more about the psychology of design and the business side of things that I did visual communication as a degree. But coming out of it as a professional, I've done every job under the sun, and I implore anybody who just cracks on and gets a day job in order to fuel their passion. If they want to be an artist, you can't just suddenly drop everything in and it's going to happen. And when you finally do get into a position where I'm at, where it is your full-time freelance work, you really have to keep that ball rolling. And I'm fortunate enough that I have a manager, but I still look for work myself as a freelancer. I still have to reach out and contact people and make those connections and camaraderie with other artists. There's a great artist out there called Brett Manning, I'm sure you're familiar with. And Brett Manning, she loves this show as well. Hey, Brett.
Hi, Brett.
And I absolutely adore her work. And, she will always promote other artists herself as well. And I think that's a very important thing to do. And it's the same with podcasting. I see a lot of podcasters promoting other podcasts, which is great. because you all feed and grow together. There's a sort of a stigma with, if you're onto something good, you should keep it close to your chest. And that really doesn't serve any purposes for anyone. You lock yourself in and you sort of cut your fingers off if you do that. You have to share. You have to not necessarily give away your work or your own leads or your own opportunities, but you absolutely have to pull other people up around you, because they will do the same. It's like the Bugsy Malone song, isn't it? You give a little love and it all comes back to you.
Yeah.
And it's very important that you focus on other people, but don't compare yourself to them either. And as my mum said, no one's going to knock on the door and say, is Sam Shearon there? You have to get out there. You have to get out there and show people what you do. Be as present online as you possibly can. Put all your work out there, even your sketches. Nothing has to be the best. And the work will come. If you want to illustrate book covers, then contact those authors. Find out if they already have an artist that they work with all the time, or whether their publisher is the person that finds the artists. And quite often you can find yourself working for a publishing company who have several authors, and they will always come back to you for this constant stream of work, which is a great way to start to branch out and have your work seen by more people. Because of course they're going to promote the book, they're going to promote the cover of the book, and just make sure that your name's on there. It's really about just pushing yourself as far as you can without spamming people. That's also very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to point out, folks, that Sam is a professional artist. He makes his living doing this, but he is also very approachable. And that's a huge thing, because I think people get this idea that they have to be kind of aloof and kind of better than the audience, or unapproachable in order to kind of perpetuate an image. And I want to share something, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show. Like, obviously, I'm a fan of your work, but like, I have a lot of respect for you personally, and this is why. When I first started this podcast, I approached you about custom, like, commissioning artwork. I knew fuck all about commissioning artwork, had no idea what to expect in terms of cost, and you didn't need to give me the time of day. You didn't even need to do that much, but you did. And you explained some things to me, and not in a condescending way at all. You just said, oh yeah, this is my day rate, this is what to expect, and it was at the point that was more than I could afford, and you were fine with that. But it was a connection, you made it, and here we are. 4 years later, we're sitting here having a conversation. But, you didn't have to do that, and you did. And so I've always respected you for that. And folks, I just want to just remind you that this is the way to approach things. Because there's no need to be rude, and there's no need to be better than, because it's all the same in the end.
Yeah,
of course
absolutely.
It is.
Yeah.
Of course it is. I mean, I remember being very humbled when Sam went out of his way to send me a message to tell me how much he liked Mysteries and Monsters. And I was taken aback, because obviously Sam's someone whose work I appreciate and loved his input when he was on Into the Fray. And obviously Sam helped me become probably the coolest dad in the UK at Christmas, with a very generous helping hand for some wonderful artwork that he helped me to impress my daughter. So I concur with everything you say, Bren. Sam is a gentle and humble man, but a highly talented person. And I'm delighted that through the world of podcasting and being weird, that I've got to know him.
Yeah.
Don't stop, guys. Keep going. This is great.
Yeah. Well, now we got to kill you. This is your eulogy.
Yeah.
Checks in the mail, by the way.
Yeah. Even if he is from across the Pennines.
Hey, now.
Well, I think it's when you went to Union.
You take your white rose and you stick it.
Texas Road. This is going to be a long one, so this is our final story of the night. As a young kid growing up in Amherstburg, Ontario, you couldn't help but hear about Old Texas Road. The stories surrounding the place are long and complicated, too much so to really get into here except in the broad strokes. But it is known to be deeply haunted and had an air of danger about it you couldn't help but notice, even in passing. Back in the early 90s, a group of us got together and decided we had to check out all the local legends, and the first place we decided to investigate was Texas Road and the Texas Road Graveyard. We actually investigated this area several times during our years at high school, and so I will do my best to present our adventures in an organized and comprehensible manner. Allegedly, after the rebuilding of Fort Malden in the early 1800s, a number of First Nations women were burned at the stake for witchcraft, and then in the early 1900s, local groups practicing witchcraft and Satanism chose an isolated area along Texas Road to conduct their ceremonies. I kind of think that's bullshit. It has been a hot spot for this type of event ever since. Every couple of generations, the events pick up and start to happen again until they become a community problem and are dealt with by the town and the law. Also, don't believe that either. In the late 80s, the event started to pick up again. It was said that the original ceremonial area had eroded into the ravine at the end of Texas Road, and that some of it still existed and could be seen, especially the sacrificial altar stone that supposedly still existed in the bottom of the ravine. This is where we started our investigation, to see if we could find the altar stone. We went in early on a Saturday afternoon, as police heavily patrol the area at night. We parked our car up the road and walked in, entering the ravine at the old bridge crossing. The bridge had a square cement foundation about 10 feet wide, large enough for a person to walk under. The area was littered with satanic graffiti and garbage, old tires, barbed wire, other junk. None of it was very interesting, so we decided to walk further along the ravine. Trees formed a canopy over the ravine, lending it an old, peaceful air. The ravine twisted behind Sutton Creek Forest and became wider. About a mile along, we found several large stones that had fallen into the ravine, and on the forest ground above were also old stones. They were large round rocks the size of giant pumpkins. They did look like they formed a rough circle at one time. In the middle was a large flat slab stone half buried in the ravine wall. At first it did not look like much, but there was a cavity behind it that allowed you to see the side of the stone hidden by the dirt. On the stone were several carvings of pentagrams and crosses, along with letters and symbols. Many of the carvings were half under the dirt. All appeared to have been there for many years, as they were weathered down. We had found the altar stone. We wanted to return later with a camera and take some pictures, but cops intercepted us on our way out. They had spotted our car and waited, so we agreed with them when they suggested we find somewhere new to hang out. We didn't return again until the fall, on a Saturday before Devil's Night. All day we tried to get into the area, but because of Devil's Night approaching, there was a heavy police presence that didn't thin out until after midnight. Finally, around 2 a.m., we felt secure enough to do a slow drive-by. And that's when we saw it. A dark figure standing in the bushes. It was cloaked all in black and had a pale green face with an extended nose. It was scary. The figure jumped out in front of the car, forcing our driver to stop, and that's when the other two figures jumped from the shadows and landed on the trunk and roof of the car. These men were screaming and banging on the car. We all screamed too, and the driver hit the horn before starting to drive off. The hooded figure in front jumped on the hood, and it was only when he realized we were picking up speed that he jumped back off, followed by the other two. I could see them behind us in the red glow of our taillights. One of the figures was wearing Nike running shoes. The big white swoosh gave it away. It was just thugs looking to scare or rough us up, but it worked. It scared the hell out of us. We decided to come back again after Halloween.
We returned about a week later in November, again at night and again with my friend driving. This time it was almost 3 a.m. before the cops took off, and we decided we were going to do a drive-by drop-off. Two of us guys and the girl would go into the forest with our Polaroid to take pictures of the altar stone. The driver and one other friend would stay with the car. The driver would give us 45 minutes to get down to the ravine, to the altar stone, and then cruise back up to pick us up. If we missed him, he would try again in 20 minutes, and if that failed, we'd meet him at the farmhouse down the road. This was a dumb plan, but we just didn't know it at the time. The three of us quickly jumped out of the car and made a dash for the bridge's edge, to climb down into the ravine. It was a very cool, clear night, and a slight fog curled around the base of the trees. Thanks to the moonlight, we could see our way along the ravine floor, although the shadows sometimes made the footing awkward, and even though it was only half a mile, we realized pretty quickly that getting to the altar stone and back in 45 minutes was going to be tough. We started to run. 20 minutes of running later, we'd figured we were close and started to walk slowly again, looking for the large stones, but with no luck. We continued for another 5 minutes or so. until we started to hear footsteps from the shadows in the forest above us. We all froze still like statues. My senses focused on trying to confirm the next crunching sound of a leaf, trying to pinpoint who or what was passing. Another minute went by as we stood motionless. About 40 or so feet away, a white horse moved from the shadows. It was peaceful looking, but seemed bothered. The horse moved through a cluster of trees and disappeared. It had to have been the ghost horse that roams the area around Texas Road Graveyard. Needless to say, we were now terribly frightened and spent several moments in awe. With all our time spent, we no longer had time to look for the stones, so we turned back. Going back was harder than going forward. The fog was setting in thicker towards the bridge, and the moonlight was not cutting through the trees like it had earlier. The three of us stayed close together, and we rushed down the ravine. After about 20 minutes of this, we realized we had already been about 45 minutes in the forest. It didn't seem to be more than halfway back. We were going to miss the first pickup. Worse yet, with the fog closing in, we were quickly losing our sense of distance and direction. We were maybe a quarter of a mile out when we heard the man laugh. It was beyond creepy. Echoing through the trees, in a deep voice that rattled through our bones, we heard, "We have guests." We were not alone in the woods, and we were now in the company of people who not only were creeping around in the forest at night, but were comfortable enough there to mess with us. I knew in my bones we were in deep trouble, and it was like the others knew it as well, because almost at the same time, we bolted up the side of the ravine, opposite from where the voice was coming from, then took off into the forest. I knew that nearby there was a cornfield, and we may be able to hide in it. We could hear several people chasing us not far behind. One of my friends was a young girl who was almost hyperventilating from fear, and I thought about hiding until they passed, but with her huffing, they would surely find us. After a few seconds, we came to the cornfield and busted into the corn, but we were stomping it down as we went, and the guys chasing us would see that. So I stopped my friends and directed them back out of the field into the narrow gap between it and the forest. We moved slowly and quietly, keeping low. This allowed us to catch our breaths and make a break for the road. Stopping briefly as the people chasing us passed through into the cornfield. They were far away, but we could still hear them stomping down the corn looking for us, so we continued to move along the tree line towards the road. We would have missed our second pickup, and our friend would now be parked at the farmhouse, which put up about 2 miles up the road on the far end of the cornfield. It was going to be a long walk, especially along the cornfield in the soft mud. It clung to our boots like cement blocks. After a few minutes, we heard the people chasing us turn back into the forest. Fearing that they would soon pick up our muddy tracks, we turned into the cornfield to walk along the rows. I wanted so badly to get back to the road, and I've never in my life wanted to see a cop quite so much. After about 20 minutes or so, we broke through the cornfield and stood at the edge of a big ditch next to the road. Our legs were sore and tired, and we used sticks to scrape off the brick-sized globs of mud from our boots.
Finding the road had been a relief, but we were all still very freaked out about our pursuers, who we had not heard in a while. We started walking along the ditch towards the meeting point with our friend, all the while looking for a good point to cross the road. We started into the ditch at a spot we thought would be crossable when we saw a set of headlights moving towards us. I looked at them and realized they were large and square. Truck headlights. Standing on the edge of the ditch, we watched as the lights got closer. Then, about half a mile down the road, the truck stopped in front of the bridge, and several people passed through the headlights. I could hear them laughing. It was our pursuers from the woods. We quickly stumbled back up to the edge of the ditch and fled into the corn as the truck roared up the road. We all dropped to the ground as the truck slowed by the edge of the cornfield. They had floodlights and were using them to sweep for us, all the while drinking and tossing their empties out of the window. We stayed completely still until they got bored and gave up, at which point they spun out their tires and rocketed off down the road. When they had been gone a while, we continued on towards our pickup location. When we finally got to the farm and saw our friend's car, we ran to it and banged on the door, scaring the hell out of both of them. When they saw who it was and how frantic we were, they let us in and headed towards home. On the way, we told them of the crazy people in the forest and didn't return to Texas Road again for almost a year. It took us the better part of an afternoon to clean the mud out of that car. We never did get our picture. The next spring we had bad rains and the whole area flooded. Many of the roads were washed out for almost a week. Construction crews worked on the drainage for the Texas Road area, digging out the ravine and completely changing its shape. We returned the following summer, in the daytime. We walked to the top edge of the ravine, but could not find the altar stone, though we did find dead animals tied to many of the trees near the bridge. Several days later, the paper actually printed a story about several dead or near dead animals that were found tied to trees and telephone poles along Texas Road and one of the other concession roads nearby. It mostly consisted of roadkill, but there were a few cats, dogs, and even birds. It was disturbing. A year after that, they closed the road for bridge repairs and never reopened it.
And then they burned the whole forest to the ground. And
yeah, that's when you use Ripley's nuclear option, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, this one isn't even, I don't think, is really paranormal, but I just think, again, it's such a great example of liminal space, because you're bumping up against someone else's world, and your chances are your life doesn't matter much to them.
Yeah. It's reminiscent, as you were mentioning earlier, of the weed growers out in the in the middle of nowhere, and whatever they get up to, if you stumble across them, you're in their world. So it's pretty interesting that you could go out into a field and you have all this satanic panic nonsense, teenagers in the woods scaring other people, but then again, it makes you think, who are these people just hanging around waiting to scare people? Yeah, who does that?
Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us here, man. This has been a ton of fun. I appreciate you giving us so much of your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been really good to talk to you finally, and I'd love to do this again.
Yeah, you're welcome back anytime. For those of folks who don't know where to find you, again, I assume most everyone does, but where should they look for Mr. Sam Shearon?
You can find all the links, all the social media links, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Patreon, even YouTube. They're all on my website. It's pretty easy to find. So it's Mr. as in the word, Mister, Sam Shearon. So MrSamShearon.com. And that's where you'll find me.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. And like I said, we're going to have to get you back to do this another time.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Brennan. And I'll talk to you soon.
It's been a pleasure. Take care, Sam.
Trains do not pass through this town. Weakest old lines into the stream. Catch some peace of mind. Listen for the scream.
Hey there, listeners. Before you reach for that skip 15 seconds ahead button, I promise you this isn't an ad. We wanted to take a minute to talk to you about mental health. On this show, I've always tried to be as honest and open as possible about my struggles with depression and anxiety, because even though we've come a long way towards acknowledging the very real damage these things can do, there is still way too much lingering stigma about reaching out for help. And when you start to feel like there's no help, it's easy to start feeling like there's no hope. But Paul has joined me today to remind you there is always hope and there's always help.
We're not going to try and talk you out of self-harming right now, because we know that's not how it works. Instead, what we wanted to do was tell you something now and hope that should things get bad, you'll remember it and make a phone call or send a text message before you make any permanent decisions. As someone who knows all too well just how important mental health can be, it's never too late to reach out.
In Canada, the number to call is 133-456-4566. In the USA, the number to call is 1-800-273-5400. 273-8255.
In the UK, the number to call is 116 123 or text SHOUT, that's SHOUT, to 85258. In Australia, the number to call is 131114.
However bad shit seems, it will pass. And no matter what your brain might be telling you at any given moment, and believe me when I say I know this intimately, there are people who love you and people who care deeply about how you treat yourself. Should a time come when you find yourself despairing, please know that we've both been where you are, and there is a way back to the world. Take care. Welcome back. Thanks again to Sam Shearon for hanging out with us here today. You can find links to all his socials in the show notes for the show, or by going to his website at MrSamShearon.com, and that's Mr. all spelled out, Mister. Thanks also, of course, to Luke Greensmith, Anthony Germain, and Sarah Kent for everything they do. Of course, our best wishes go to Sarah. Sarah got a busted arm about 2.5, 3 weeks ago now, and so she is recovering. Thankfully, she is still young, Paul. She's younger than all of us by a disgusting margin, and so she will heal very well and quickly. Whereas, I hurt my back, 16 months ago, and it still bothers me.
Yeah. I had to spend the day after Eurovision in bed watching Murder, She Wrote, so I know what you mean.
What's coming up on Mysteries and Monsters?
Well, currently this week we've got an episode discussing the myths and legends of dragons, and are they just myths and legends? So we look at the history of dragons and modern day sightings from around the world, which are quite surprising. And then I've got a couple of episodes coming up dealing with possessions. One case has never really been in print in the modern era and was rediscovered 2 or 3 years ago. And then we've got the return of Stephen Bassett down the line, and also Evelyn Hollow coming to join me, who was the resident parapsychologist on the wonderful Battersea Poltergeist. So, yeah, we've got some very varied and interesting topics coming up.
Fantastic. And where can everyone find you online, my friend?
You can find us wherever you can search for Mysteries and Monsters across all social media platforms, YouTube, and mysteriesandmonsters.com.
Brilliant. I'm, of course, at Largely the Truth on Instagram and Twitter. And you can find the show at Ghost Story Guys on Twitter, Instagram, on Twitter and Facebook. And then we're also on Instagram as the Ghost Story Guys. And as we mentioned at the top of the show, if you want to become a patron, you can help support this movable feast. You can head to patreon.com/Ghost Story Guys. That's patreon.com/Ghost Story Guys. We have all kinds of levels of support. From $1 is just saying thank you, which is deeply appreciated. I mean, if everyone who listened to, if half the people who listen to the show, if a third of the people who listen to the show gave $1, that would be a life-changing amount of money. But again, so if you can support us, patreon.com/Ghost Story Guys is the way to do it. If you can't, we more than understand. Times are tough. Just listening and telling your friends is more than enough. But if you can support the show, you get access to all kinds of bonus stuff. There's our at least monthly me and Paul segments, which is just me and Paul shooting the breeze about whatever happens to come into our brains, which is kung fu movies or music or food or whatever the hell's going on in our lives. It's always a trip. The last one, I know we covered topics such as looking down the barrel of a shotgun when it's being held by someone else, which was a thrilling topic, and a lot of other stuff. There's also Sunken Library, which is a separate paranormal podcast where I talk about any number of again, different topics that just don't quite fit the format of the main show. You get our monthly patron movie night where Paul and I watch a classic, in air quotes, usually monster movie. We've done Horror Express, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, Snow Beast, Kingdom of the Spiders. Yes. This month we're going to be watching the 1972 classic Frogs, starring Ray Milland and Sam Elliott. So you get all that plus physical rewards, other digital rewards, and so much more at patreon.com/Ghost Story Guys. Don't forget, if you've got a story you want to share with the show, you can get a hold of us at ghoststoryguys@gmail.com. You can also reach us on the Ghost line at 1-888-588-6920. That's 1-888-588-6920. You can leave your comment, or question as one or a series of voicemails, and we may play it here on the show in the opening to the B segment. You can also text us at 925-553-4789. If you want to hear a little more from me, my episode of the Adkins Undisputed podcast finally dropped. So you can find that pretty much everywhere fine podcasts live. Again, the show is Adkins Undisputed. And me and the host, Mike Scott, talk about the 2015 action film Zero Tolerance. So if you thought, geez, what does Brent have to say on things that are not paranormal? Well, that's where to go. Our theme song, Radio, Into the Darkness We Go, is composed and performed by Peter of Pizzanta Music. You can find more from him by searching for Pizzanta Music wherever you get your tunes. Our story's theme is The Future Belongs to Them Now by Hexagram. Find more from them by searching for Hexagram wherever you get your music. And of course, that's Hexagram with 2 X's, not 3. Big thanks to our musical guest, Michael LaBella. The song we played was Black Mountain / Tracks from his latest album, Appalachia. And that's available on iTunes and again, everywhere else you stream your music. Michael's a talented guy. It's a great record. Make sure to check it out. I guess that's going to do it.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another show. But until then,
Into the darkness we go.
Yeah, they've reassured me that the stronger the reaction, the better your immune system is. So I'm clinging to that, and I'm looking forward to the second dose finishing me off, probably.
I was going to say, so you cannot die. All right, gents. So,
Hello, Brennan.
Yeah.
hello.
Hi, Brennan. Sorry.
Oh, shit. No.
Yeah, welcome to Mysteries and Monsters.
If I hear 2 people who know what the fuck they're talking about talking, I let them talk.
I don't know if you can hear the neighbor's dogs barking.
Nope, can't hear it.
Good. You're lucky.
It's all right. I had randy pigeons earlier. I had to mute myself. Well, I think they were randy pigeons. I hope so, anyway.
Well, ask no questions. You will learn no horrors.
Yeah, I'm new to the neighborhood. Could be anything.
Just a couple people fucking and making pigeon noises.
Yeah, well, yeah. It's a very eclectic area, as is this side of Sheffield.
My neighborhood's just poor old people and guys who want to fight me. That seems to be my neighborhood.
One and the same.
Yeah, often. I went for a walk night before last and someone tried to start a fight with me again. We're not doing this.
It's the only way it should be.
Well, let's not get crazy here.
Well, you guys in the Commonwealth need to come back in line.
Yeah, because things are going so well for you.
Yes. Why do you think I'm in Los Angeles? Let's see. Let me just pull this up a second. Oh, yes. I love this one. Very disturbing.
Yeah, well, he was sometimes quiet. Sometimes, he'd walk into the room, his eyes pinned out on cocaine.
Oh, hang on. Just had a motorcycle go past.
That was a quiet motorcycle. I didn't hear it.
Didn't hear a thing.
Ghost Rider.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I mean, hey, someone's willing to rub my belly up, but let's just roll with it. Let's not fight this. Oh, wow, I only recorded that. Okay, well, that's fair. I only recorded my half of that in Zoom, so that's good.